This video is part 3 of a 3-part video series on producing these star-shaped pattern blocks on a bandsaw. In part 1 of the video series, we cut these small trapezoid or parallelogram shaped pieces on the bandsaw using the Accu-Slice system. And then in part 2 of this video series, we showed how to glue these pieces up to make these finished star-shaped pattern blocks. In this video, we're going to make some small wooden coasters from the 8-sided star-shaped pattern blocks that I made in some previous videos. So I'm starting with these blocks, and it's a multi-step process. First of all, putting a border on the outside of this. And I have some small pieces of wood of different colors and contrast that I'll be gluing on the outside. In some cases, I actually may put 2 or 3 layers of borders on this, just to get some additional detail to the project. So I end up with borders that look something like this. So I first of all begin by cutting some thin boards on a bandsaw. So I get some different boards of different colors and contrasts, and I cut some thin boards on the bandsaw. I'll be cutting boards 100,000 inch thick for the bottom of the coasters. And I'll be cutting additional boards of between 25 and 150,000 inch thick for the various strips that are going to be used to create the borders on the star-shaped pattern blocks. And after I get these boards, I'll cut thinner strips off of this, usually on a small table saw. End up with strips like this. Then I cut the strips into small pieces that I'll use to glue onto my block. After that's all been glued up and sanded flush, I'll then take this to the bandsaw and I'll cut 5 or 6 slices of wood from each of these blocks. Each of those slices is about 100,000 inch thick, which will become the top portion of my coaster. Then I'll take the same board that I cut on the bandsaw and I'll cut some square pieces, end up with pieces that would look like this. And usually taking two woods of different colors and contrasts and alternating the grain. In other words, in this case, the grain runs in this direction, this runs in this direction. I'll be gluing those together. I'll take my thin strip that I cut off my block, glue that on top. So I have a 3-layer system, each layer 100,000 inch thick. And because the grains run in different directions, it makes it very stable. It's not going to warp or move on you. But it's still very thin. It's only 300,000 inch thick, but yet it's very strong and very stable. And then after it's all been finished and sanded and varnished, I'll be putting a cork base on the bottom so it doesn't slip and slide on the table. For this project, we need some board strips for both the detail strips around the outside edges of the 8-sided pattern block, and also some larger thin boards to produce the 2-layer laminated base for the coasters. As we have shown in the past, these strips are most easily cut on a bandsaw using the Accu-Slice system. I'm starting with a 2-inch thick board, 5 inches wide by 24 inches long, from which I'm slicing various board thicknesses. Using the same Accu-Slice techniques, I'm slicing a smaller piece of ebony wood for some of the additional border strips. To cut my thin strips to go around the border of this 8-pointed star project, I need to slice this down to a thinner piece. And I could do this on a bandsaw, or I could do it in a table saw. Probably the table saw, the kerf is much too wide. So I have this small modeling saw that I use a lot for making these thin strips. Works out quite nicely. Has a thinner kerf blade, much like the bandsaw, so I don't waste near as much wood. So I have all this ebony that I just sliced on the bandsaw. Now I'm going to slice it into some thinner pieces to use to make some borders for these 8-pointed star blocks. I'm slicing the strips to 3/4 inch wide using a 3-inch diameter blade, 90 teeth per inch, with a 30,000th inch kerf. Okay, that's all set up to give me the right length, and I have a stop here to give me the length of the board I want, so I just push the board against there and then run it through the blade. After this video was shot, I did purchase a sliding table from Burns, which I will be using in the future. There's enough to create one border to go around my piece. I'm all set to turn these 8 star-shaped blocks into some coasters. And I've laid out my pieces I'm going to be gluing on the edges to create a border. And I'm doing these sets of 2 because out of a set of 2 of these, I should be able to get 10 or maybe even 12 coasters. So that's the plan. So I'll get, actually 3 sets of coasters from these 6 blocks. And in this set, I'm going to be putting 3 pieces of wood, maple, ebony, and walnut. This I'm going to be using 4. I have maple, ebony, maple, and then walnut. And these 2 I'll be putting ebony, maple, and padauk. So this one will take a while. This has 4 pieces. The others have 3. So I'm ready to start gluing these up. And what I'm doing here is I'll be starting here with the maple on this one. I'll be putting a maple board, here and here, rubber banding it, and then here and here, and rubber banding it. Then let that dry, then I'll sand it, and then sand it flush on the disc sander, and then do the other 4 pieces. So I'll do it actually 2 glue ups for each of these. And once again, I'm using the Type-On 3 glue. As I've done in the past, I always like to coat both surfaces with the Type-On glue just to make sure I get good coverage. I glue on the 2 maple boards to the opposite sides of the disc and then clamp it with 3 rubber bands to hold it in place while the glue dries. Allow it to dry for at least 2 hours before proceeding. I then continue to add the borders to the remaining 8-pointed star-shaped pattern blocks until everything has been assembled. Okay, these have dried overnight. So I take rubber bands off, and the next step will be to take these over to the disc sander and grind these pieces flush. Now the reason I do it this way rather than make segments is this is more accurate. If I were to make segments on the Accu-Wedge, it probably would not be perfect. With all these small pieces gluing together, this is probably not a real perfect octagon shape. So if I made segments on the Accu-Wedge, I'd have to do some final sanding to tweak it in. So this is actually faster and more accurate, cutting the pieces like this, gluing them on. Then I'll sand them flush to the surface and glue on the remaining pieces, across the remaining sides. So this is actually more accurate than making wedges. I first sanded 2 faces to get the maple pieces to lie flush with the disc surfaces. I then sand the edges of the maple pieces to be just flush with the opposite sides and flush with the padauk surface. I then repeat this process for the remaining maple boards. I then glue on the maple boards to the remaining 4 side surfaces of the pattern block, and then repeat this process for all of the 8-sided star pattern disc. After the glue is dried, I'll take these blocks back to the disc sander and sand these boards flush as was done previously. Since I will be gluing on additional layers to the border, it's very important that all the pieces are sanded flush with no protruding edges. And here's the finished border on the block ready for additional layers to be added. Now I just continue the process, adding additional pieces and layers and sanding in between each set, and do that until everything is complete. Okay, I finished gluing my borders on my 8-pointed star-shaped patterns, and these are the 6 I'm going to be using to make coasters. And you see how much nicer these look, putting a border on versus a piece that doesn't have a border on it. Just adds so much more detail to the piece. Makes it stand out a lot better. So it was worth the effort to spend the time to put those borders on. And these borders were put on one layer at a time. I have one project here in which I used a strip. This strip of wood is actually 5 layers of wood, about between 10 and 15,000 inch thick, so they're very, very fine lines. So as a result, I get real nice fine lines on my project. They don't meet exactly one another, they meet like at an angle, but that's fine, it's a different way of showing the image. But it's just another way to do this, that you get more finer lines, and actually it's much faster gluing up a one board rather than gluing up 7 boards at a time. So that came out quite nice. But it's just another way you can do it. You don't have to use a solid piece of wood, you can use a laminate strip. So these are ready now to put on the bandsaw and slice into my layers. Now when I did my prototype, I cut layers 0.100 inch thick. That's what these are. So out of one board I was able to get 5 layers, each 100,000 inch thick. But I thought, I'd like to get more out of a piece of wood. So how would it work if I used a layer 50,000 inch thick? In other words, half the thickness of this. So that's what I did here. I took the same board and I cut off layers 0.050, 50,000 inch thick, and out of a board I got 7 pieces that I made into coasters. So actually you got a lot better production from my boards. So out of a set of 2 of these I'll get between 12 and 14 discs that I can use to make 12 to 14 coasters. So just a more efficient use of my wood. So going forward, all these boards I'll be cutting 50,000 inch thick. It worked great. There was no problems, no issues. The boards cut nice and flat. They didn't warp or anything as I was cutting them. They stayed flat. There was no cracking, and I glued them up and they worked fine. So just more efficient use of my wood and get better productivity. I'm ready to attach my 8-pointed star patterns to my MDF boards. And I have 3 boards here, again 3/4 inch MDF, about 12 to 13 inches long, which will fit my 12-inch carriage on the Accu-Slice system. And in the past, I would have mounted these boards right directly to the MDF sheet directly, using either double-sided tape or usually I prefer gluing these days. I think the glue works better than the double-sided tape. But in doing that, if I end up cutting down to the very end and I end up cutting into the MDF, the blade can actually move on you because the MDF has a different density than the block that I'm cutting, and as a result that blade can warp and move on you. So you may not get a real good cut on your last piece. But by putting these thin strips of wood on here and then gluing my boards to the top of that, I can cut all the way down to the very end and not lose any wood in the process. It's just a much more efficient way of getting 100% yield from my boards, because I want to get every ounce out of these, because there's a lot of work making these blocks. So I'm ready to start gluing these up. Be gluing them up one at a time and just putting some, again, Type Bond 3 glue on my strips and then gluing my block on top of it. And I will be cutting these 2 at a time. Let me put some weights on that and let that dry for a couple hours. I'm all set to cut a set of discs on the bandsaw. And I have my Accu-Slice system set up and with the 12-inch carriage. So now I'm ready to mount my disc on a sacrificial fence on the bandsaw. And another new thing I've done, which I learned in the latest video on the making the guitar backs and sides, I like having my sacrificial fence ride on the bandsaw table. Again, just riding not enough that it creates too much friction that I can't push it through, but enough that it slides through. What this does do is it reduces vibration because you have an additional contact point on the table. So you get less vibration, you get smoother cuts. The other thing I did in that video, I actually clamped, before I screwed this to the table, or to the carriage, I actually clamped it in place. And I do like these thread automatically adjusting clamps. So just make sure that slides easily. Then I usually pre-drill the holes. Now next, I want to get every piece of wood off of here, so I'm doing things a little bit different again. First of all, set my gauge to 0. And I push my block that it touches the bandsaw blade. And then I lock everything in place. And now my first cut will be open my mag jig clamps. 1 revolution for the bandsaw blade, which is 50 thousandths, and 1 revolution for another 50 thousandths. Because I'm cutting off 50 thousandths inch thick pieces of wood. Now I'll be locking my mag jig clamps, and now I'm ready to cut. Now I did install this brand new 8 teeth per inch blade. Previously I had a 10 teeth per inch blade on here for cutting some other pieces, but because this wood's a little bit thicker, I went to an 8 teeth per inch blade, just less chance of it gumming up the blade. So now I do have my safety shields installed as much as possible. That's all our discs. See how many I did get out of that. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So I got 14 discs. Each of those 50 thousandths of an inch thick. And you see what's left on my sacrificial fence. Very, very thin layer left, almost nothing. Next I'm going to cut some boards, or some slices of boards here, 25 thousandths of an inch thick, to see how that works for making these coasters. If that works, I can even get more delivery from my boards. So let's see what we get out of this. I was able to get 10 slices off that board, 25 thousandths of an inch thick. So when the boards were 100 thousandths of an inch thick, I got 5. Going to 25 thousandths, I got 10. So it's actually double the yield. However, they're pretty thin, and they'll work. You just have to be very careful you don't sand through them when you're doing a final sanding on them, because that's only 25 thousandths of an inch thick. But they will work, and I'll make some coasters out just to prove it. But it is pushing limits on how thin you can make them. But and I'm all set to do my glue up to make these coasters. So I have my 3 patterns that were finished, each of these 50 thousandths of an inch thick. I said I did cut these pieces that were 25 thousandths of an inch thick, but you can see that they are warped already, and they're pretty thin. And my concern is they may be too thin. They may actually work, but you have to be careful you don't sand through them because they're so thin. And if they do warp, so require a little more pressure to press it down when you glue them. But it will work, and it'll save wood, and you get more yield from your boards if you use those thinner pieces. So I'll make those also. So these are all my backing boards. The backing boards, as they did in the past, will be 2 layers. Like in this case, I'll be having a padauk on the bottom and then a maple in the middle, and then my disc on top. So that'll be my 3 layers. In this one, I'll be using wingy and maple. This one I'll be using walnut and cherry. And this one I'll be using wingy and maple again. So my set's all set up to glue. So let me move some of this out of the way and we'll start our glue up. When I first glued up these prototype versions, I had a lot of trouble with the layers slipping and sliding as I was gluing, because I actually glue in 3 layers at one time, and it's just hard to control the movement of the wood. So I made this plate and I modified it slightly, and what I did is I fit my backing board in and I put some small finishing nails around the outside. So when I put my second layer on, there's not much room where it can move. It can move maybe a 1/16th, maybe an 1/8 of an inch at the most, but at least I don't have a lot of slipping and sliding on my board, so that may help a lot. So basically what I did is I drew out the pattern for my disc on here, put some nails about a 1/16th of an inch outside the line, so it has a little bit of space to move. And I sunk them down enough that they're just the height of these two boards. And when I put my disc on top, my disc can actually be above the nails, so the nails won't interfere with this disc. So the only disc I have to worry about moving is this. So I'll watch that as I'm gluing. It doesn't, slip off the side like that. So in this one, I'll be putting a padauk on the bottom, maple in the middle, and this on top. And it's important these grains go in opposite directions. This grain goes in this direction, this goes in this direction, so that they help keep the wood stable so it doesn't warp on me. So I'm ready to get started here. The other thing is I find it helps to put enough glue on but not put too much. The more glue you put on, the more chance you have for slipping and sliding as you're clamping it. And I put wax paper on both sides so it doesn't stick to the board. Another board on top, then I'll take this to my press. I could either use clamps or I could put this in my press. I prefer using my press, it's a little bit easier. I actually have 3 presses in my shop I use for doing this. I'm doing a lot of blocks, so I'll be using all 3 of them today. But I put it in here, my block on top. I'll put some pressure on it. And then I'll take it off to see how far it moved. It's slipping and sliding. And so far that looks good. I like to check it 2 or 3 times until the glue sets. You see that's perfect. It didn't slip or slide off. When I cut it out, it'll be completely surrounded by the backing board. I'll let that set for maybe an hour. I finished gluing up all the 8-pointed star, thin laminates on these double laminate layers. I spent a good half day yesterday gluing these all up and let them dry overnight. And they all came out pretty good, even including the one that was 25,000 of an inch thick. That looks pretty good. So these are ready now to finish. So the next step will be to take these to the jigsaw. I'll be cutting off the excess wood, just slightly proud of this outer surface, and then I'll be sanding it flush to the surface of the thin laminate here. And then also sanding the surface and finishing them. And then as I did before, I'll be putting a piece of cork on the bottom to finish it off. Okay, I'm ready to cut the excess wood off my pieces. And I'm using my scroll saw. And I have a 15 teeth per inch blade on here. And I'll just be cutting just proud, or just outside the walnut strip on here. Then I'll sand it flush to the edge, but I'll just sand it just outside the strip there. I have all my pieces ready to sand. And what I'll be doing is I'll be sanding off the excess to sand this down right to the border. It is important when you're sanding, you sand just to the edge and keep your edges nice and straight and parallel. With finished sanding, you do get a little bit of a fuzzy on the bottom, which we'll take off next. Okay, I'm going to start the sanding now of these pieces. And this is the finish right off the bandsaw. It's actually pretty good. I used an 8 teeth per inch blade on the bandsaw, but there's some minor saw marks, and there's some glue stains from gluing it up. So those need to be sanded off. So I like using, I could run these through my board sander, but actually I like using the sand flea. It's better. And I'll be sanding both the backs and the fronts. The backs will get rid of these fuzzies on the edges, and then I'll sand enough on the front to get most of it out, and then I'll need hand sanding after that. So they're already been, edges have all been sanded on the disc sander, so they're all ready to finish now. And then of course there's always hand sanding. Although the sand flea minimized that. I use that sand flea system to get rid of all the glue marks and all the bandsaw blade marks, so they're pretty good. So it just needs a final sanding, using some 220 grit and then finishing with some 320 grit. So this is 220 grit sandpaper. And then 320 to finish it. This completes our 8-pointed star-shaped coasters. And to make these, I started off with a 8-pointed star-shaped pattern block. I added a border on the outside to give a little more detail. And then I put these on the bandsaw, sliced them into thin layers. Added additional layers on the bottom of alternating contrasting woods. I also put a piece of cork on the bottom so it doesn't slip and slide on the table. And these are coated with about 5 coats of polyurethane. Gives a nice finished polished surface. There are a few things that I would do differently if I made these coasters in the future. First, I would make the 8-pointed star pattern disc all 50 thousandths of an inch thick. This is just more productive than cutting them to 100 thousandths inch thick. I would not cut down to 25 thousandths. These were just too thin, and you do have the possibility of sanding through the layers, especially on the edges, as I did in one of the samples. Next, I would glue the base laminate layers separately. In addition, I would prefer to use 3 laminate layers for the base, with alternating grain direction. I did see some minor warping of the coasters, which I feel could be eliminated by using 3 layers. These layers could possibly be thinner, possibly 50 thousandths to 75 thousandths inch thick. I would then glue the final star-shaped pattern disc separately on top of these discs. Once again, if you have any questions or concerns on this project, please give us a call or drop us an email. And once again, thank you for watching this video.